let us talk a little bit about relationship between fundamental rights and DPSPs, right? Relationship would also mean differences, similarities, or whatever, right? But let's talk about the differences. What is that? Now this has this is justiciable. You know what is a justiciable thing, right? Not justifiable, justiciable. Okay. So FRs are justiciable and DPSPs they are non-justiciable. Simple. However, they are in a way enforceable somewhere else. Another important difference is that the fundamental rights are actually negative obligations of the state. Most of them are largely negative. So they are what? They are negative obligations, right? Means they tell the state not to do certain things. They prevent the state from doing certain things. That's the state shall not discriminate on the grounds of so and so. The state shall not deprive persons, of their life and personal liberty. The state shall not do this, shall not do that. That's a negative obligation, right? So, and DPSPs are what? DPSPs that is a very positive because they tell the state to do this, to do that. Okay, take action. So they are positive directions, right? So it's very simple that they are positive directions in that sense. Then these are, of course, fundamental rights are more individualistic in nature, right? They largely talk about individual rights. These are more for common good, more for common good. This is an important thing. Now, fundamental rights are basically, they say that they are political rights. And they are there to establish political democracy, right? Why? Because they talk about equality, they talk about state treating everyone equal. What is that? That's all more of a political democracy. They help in establishing political democracy, right? On the other hand, the DPSPs intend to establish what? They intend to establish social and economic democracy. Most of the provisions, as we will see, talk about social and economic democracy in the country, right? Then you can also enlist one more difference, that the fundamental rights are about what the state guarantees. So it is a guarantee that the state is giving. And DPSP is more about aspirations. The fundamentals are the guarantees. They are guarantees that exist. They are given. They're there, right? DPSPs are largely the future aspirations. Champak Dorai Rajan, right? Versus State of Madras, right? So this is 1951, I guess. Now, in this, the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot do this. The matter was about violation of the fundamental rights in the Article 14 and 19, okay? And it was versus the provisions that are there in the DPSP for making special provisions for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Here, the Supreme Court held that fundamental rights cannot be violated to implement DPSP. Okay, it actually made it clear that fundamental rights, you cannot violate them because, and they said that DPSP is subservient, right? Or to fundamental rights. Means it is lower in kind of it is secondary to fundamental rights, right? It is not superior to fundamental rights. It also said that in case of a conflict between the two, right? In conflicting cases, it is the fundamental right shall prevail. So this was a very plain judgment that came in 1951. 1950 or 51, they just checked that, but I believe around that time Champak Dorarajan case came. And this was largely thought to be a settled matter by then, before the matter again came up in Kerala versus Kerala Education Bill case. We've also briefly talked about it. So, yahan tak to you know that fundamental rights are assuming a superior status compared to the DPSPs, right? Then we come to another case, which is Kerala Education Bill case. This is what is it known like. Now, in this matter, when this matter came to the Supreme Court, this time the Supreme Court was not as one-sided as it sounded in the Champak Dorai Rajan case. Fundamental rights have to be interpreted with regards to DPSP. It means that fundamental rights are superior, it held that, but they're not absolute. And they will have to be interpreted with regard to DPSP. As DPSP talk about common good. And to achieve a common good, if some individual fundamental rights are violated, then you'll have to strike a balance. So to protect a fundamental right of an individual, you cannot sacrifice a very large or larger common good. What does it mean? Now, this is a very important observation of the court. It said that there is no inherent conflict because it is the same makers of the Constitution. The Constitutional Assembly that gave fundamental rights is the same Constituent Assembly that gave DPSPs. So they can never, ever mean to have any conflict between them, right? There would always mean that these two things go together, that these two things go towards fulfilling the objective of the Constitution, right? They cannot see a conflict between these two. For example, if you decide, if you make a scheme of things, you make some rules, for example, to achieve certain objective. So in one part you make some kind of rules, in other part you make some kind of rule, in other part you make lots of rules in parts. So it is very natural that when you're making those rules, you will not make conflicting rules, right? You will make complementing rules that complement each other. So the court said that there's no inherent conflict, and hence whenever there is any seeming conflict, seeming means not real conflict doesn't exist. The court said no inherent meaning originally there is no conflict. To begin with, there is no conflict. Fundamentally, there is no conflict. However, that is the meaning of inherent. However, in its interpretation, it may sometimes so appear that there is a conflict between these two. And if there is a situation where it seems or where it appears with different interpretations that there is a conflict between these two, then the court will have to consider and go by such interpretations which create harmony between these two. Okay, so if there is a conflict, if there is if conflict appears, because there is no inherent conflict, if conflict appears, then you have to interpret them with harmony, right? Harmonious interpretation, for example. And interpretation, you have to interpret in such a way that there is a harmony, that the conflict is resolved. The interpretation has to be like that. And this interpretation is also called construction. And this gave us another doctrine of harmonious construction. There's a very important doctrine which says that, and it doesn't only apply to fundamental rights and DPSP, it applies to all the provisions in the Constitution. Whenever there is a seeming conflict, you have to interpret those two provisions which seem to be in conflict, which appear to be in conflict, in such a way that both of them should be able to be implemented. What does it mean? There's a doctrine of harmonious construction, right? So which means you will have to, if there is a conflict, then you will have to decide whether this should be implemented or this, right? Any one of them. The court says no, harmonious construction, interpret in such a way that the state should be able to implement both this and that, right? So implement both the provisions which are seemingly in conflict. Now this led to a very balanced relationship between the DPSPs, and this was of course going on. And then Parliament in 1971 does something. What do they do? In 1971, they come up with a constitutional amendment. Which one? 25th Constitutional Amendment. By this, if you remember, of course, some other things were also added by this, but one important thing was that was inserted was Article 331C. But then in 1971, when they came up with this amendment, this was added, 31C was added. What did 31C do? Two things. It said, again, between fundamental rights and that, it said that in the process of implementing Article 39B and 39C, if the state makes any law to implement Article 39B and 39C, it will not be unconstitutional even if it violates Article 14 and 19. Okay? So what does that mean? 19 and 31 also then. What it? No law implementing these, to be unconstitutional. Even if it violates what? Article 14, 19, 31. It is about distribution of land. It is about equal distribution of resources. It is about reducing inequality. These are these two articles that were inserted. So in Keshavananda Bharati, this was challenged, and here the court upheld the first one. He said, okay, fine, because these are very, very important directive principles of state policy, and these are such in nature that unless you violate some of the individual fundamental rights under Article 14, 19 and 31, right to equality, right to property here and right to property here, unless you do that, there is no way this directive principle of state policy can be adhered to. So because now we have what do we have? We have a doctrine of harmonious construction, which means the court will now have to say that you will have to implement both of them. Right? You can't just say, no, it violates 14, 19, 31, it is fundamental right, and the court's responsibility is to enforce fundamental right. So it will have to ignore directive principle of state policy, right? Because the court is not supposed to enforce directive principle of state policy. Court is supposed to enforce fundamental rights. So what will court do then in that case? So here, when the parliament made these changes, the court said it is fine because 39B and 39C are such that they are very important for achieving common good of a common welfare of people, and it cannot be achieved without somewhere violating some individual fundamental rights under 14, 19 and 31. Hence, such laws can be made, and even if they violate fundamental right, will be they'll not be unconstitutional. However, so it upheld first part. First part is that, right? But it struck down the second part. What is that? Second part of 31C. What was that? This, such laws not to be questioned in court of law. The court said, no, this is not done. You cannot be so blanket in saying that these laws will not be questioned in court of law, because this was struck down because it takes away judicial review, power of judicial review of the court. And it also said that judicial review is a basic structure, right? So this is what happened after that. Now you see a different kind of relationship between fundamental rights and DPSP. What do you see? You see for 39B and 39C of DPSP take precedence over Article 14, 19, and 31. They become superior in a way, right? Because to implement them, you can even violate 14, 19, and 31. So that's kind of balance, at least as far as those two are concerned, it tilted in favor of DPSP. Case one with Bharati is after that, you also know in 1976, 42nd constitutional amendment came to it again amended. Of course, it did a lot of things, but we're not talking about that. We're talking in this context. Amended Article 31C and replaced Article 39 words Article 39B and 39C with what? All or any part of DPSP. So, if the state makes any law to implement any of these 20 odd, and they are very broad, very, very broad, we will see that. And in doing so, it violates the fundamental rights of 14, 19, then they will not be unconstitutional. So this was again very blanket. So what would happen? At this stage, you see fundamental rights lose their primacy to DPSPs. The court says, and it almost finally settles the principle now. What does it say? It says, this inclusion disturbs the balance between fundamental rights and DPSPs. There has to be a balance between these two. And such inclusion disturbs the balance as it tilts it in one direction completely, right? And it said that this balance between DPSP and that is also basic structure. So it declared this to be a basic structure. Now you have another basic structure. What? Balance between fundamental right and directive principle of state policy. And because it is a basic structure, and because inclusion like this disturbs that balance, it struck it down. Because that has been, what is the current position? We will have to come to this day. Minerva Mills kind of almost settled it. And after this, it struck down all or any part of DPSP, which means that now we go back to the earlier position of 39B and 39C. Any law made by the state to implement 39B and 39C, even if it is violative of fundamental rights under Article 14 and 19, will not be unconstitutional. Okay, so this is the current position between the relationship between these two. You get it? So there is a balance now. Not all fundamental rights are superior to all DPSPs. Not all DPSPs are superior to fundamental rights. There are some DPSPs, 39B and 39C, we are superior to some fundamental rights like 14 and 19. So that's the balance that is there.